Hey everyone, today it's time for my top 10 fantasy books of all time. Now I've actually never made a top 10 fantasy books video before, but about a year and a half ago I made one for science fiction. And I'll leave a link to that in the description if you're interested. But fantasy has been my favorite genre for as long as I can remember. It's what got me into reading, and although I've been reading more science fiction over the last few years, fantasy is still the genre I always come back to. And earlier this year, I read The Lies of Locke Lamora, and I called it one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. And that made me realize I had never actually ranked my favorite fantasy books. And it actually turned out to be much harder than I expected. But before we start, there is one rule. This is a list of books, not series. So every series only gets one spot. Otherwise this list would have looked very different. Also, if your favorite isn't on here, there's a good chance I simply haven't read it yet. There are still so many fantasy series on my TBR, and I'm always happy to get recommendations. Anyway, let's just get started. At number 10 I have The Elfstones of Shannara by Terry Brooks. And the Shannara series has a pretty bad reputation. And honestly I understand why. The first book, The Sword of Shannara, follows the Lord of the Rings so closely that many readers just stop there and never continue. And I think that's a shame because The Elfstones of Shannara is a huge improvement. And this is the book where Terry Brooks really starts telling his own story. The magical tree that protects the world from demons is dying, and while one group searches for a way to save it, the rest of the world is trying to survive a demon invasion. And I really like the balance between that personal quest and a large-scale war. It's a classic epic fantasy with memorable characters, exciting action, and surprisingly emotional moments. And if you've ever wanted to try Shannara, I honestly recommend starting here instead of with the first book. At number 9 I have The Gunslinger by Stephen King. And this is probably a controversial choice because many of the Dark Tower series fans consider this the weakest book in the series. Now I haven't finished the series yet, so maybe my opinion will change, but I absolutely love this first book. And a lot of readers don't like it because it feels strange and dreamlike. And that's exactly why I did enjoy it. The atmosphere is unlike anything I've ever read. Stephen King mixes fantasy, western, horror and science fiction into something that feels completely unique. The story follows Roland as he chases the mysterious man in black across a desert. And the plot itself is fairly simple, but the atmosphere is what makes this book special. Every chapter leaves you with more questions than answers, and it creates a sense of mystery that kept me hooked from beginning to end. And even after I finished it, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And at number 8 I have Daughter of the Empire by Raymond E. Feist and Jenny Wirtz. I'm kind of breaking my own rules here, because this takes place in the same universe as another book later on the list. But these books feel so different that I don't mind making an exception. The story follows Mara of the Yokoma, who unexpectedly becomes the leader of a family after almost everyone else is killed. And instead of fighting monsters or dark lords, she has to survive political games, assassination attempts, and rival noble families trying to destroy everything she has. And Mara is one of my favorite fantasy protagonists because she wins with intelligence rather than brute force. And I also love that this book focuses much more on the politics than on battles. It proves that fantasy can be just as exciting when the conflict happens through clever planning instead of swords. And if you enjoy political fantasy, this is an easy recommendation. And at number 7, I have The Last Wish by Andrei Sapkowski. I actually picked this book up by chance while I was on holiday. And it was around the same time the Netflix series was announced, so I thought I'd see what all the excitement was about. Instead of a one long story, this book is a collection of connected short stories following Geralt of Rivia, a witcher who hunts monsters for a living. Now, normally I'm not the biggest fan of short story collections, but this one completely worked for me. And what I love most is how Sapkowski takes familiar fairy tales and completely turns them upside down. And Geralt is also a fantastic character. He acts like he doesn't care about people, but his actions constantly prove otherwise. Add in excellent dialogue and some surprisingly deep moral questions, and you get one of the most enjoyable fantasy books I've ever read. And the funny thing is that I still haven't continued the series. And I definitely need to fix that, because if the rest is anywhere near as good, near as this good, I'm sure I'll love it. And at number 6 I have The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. And here's another unpopular opinion. Most Mistborn fans seem to rank this as the weakest book in the trilogy. But for me, it's easily the best. Most fantasy books end when the evil ruler is defeated, and this book asks a much more interesting question. What happens after the revolution? Suddenly everyone believes they should rule the empire. Armies gather outside the city, and the heroes realize that building a better world is much harder than destroying the old one. And I know some readers think this book is slower because it spends much more time on politics, but that was exactly why I enjoyed it so much. And the political tension kept me just as invested as any battle scene could have. It's also the book where I enjoyed the characters the most, especially Eland, who has to learn what it really means to be a leader. And combined with Brandon Sanderson's magic system, it creates my favorite book in the original Mistborn trilogy. Alright, and then we get to number 5, which is Magician by Raymond Feist. Raymond Feist is the first author to appear twice on this list. And even though Magician and Daughter of the Empire take place in the same universe, they feel completely different. So I don't mind giving both a spot. And Magician was my favorite book that I read last year. It's a classic epic fantasy done incredibly well. The story follows Puck, an orphan who becomes the apprentice to a magician. Just as his kingdom is invaded by warriors arriving through magical rifts from another world. And what I love most about this book is that it takes familiar fantasy ideas and gives them a fresh twist. The kingdom feels like a traditional medieval fantasy, while the invading Tsarani Empire is heavily inspired by Asian cultures. And watching those two civilizations clash makes the story far more interesting than a standard good versus evil conflict. It's also one of those books that constantly makes you want to read one more chapter. The world building is excellent, the characters are memorable, and the adventure never loses its sense of wonder. And if someone asks me for a classic fantasy recommendation after The Lord of the Rings, this will probably be my first choice. Talking about Lord of the Rings, I put that one on number 4 on this list. It's written by J.R.R. Tolkien. And this is probably the least surprising book on the list. Now I know it's technically 3 books, but Tolkien wrote it as one story. And I honestly can't choose a favorite between the 3. And I don't think anyone has ever created a fantasy world quite like Middle-earth. Tolkien didn't just write the story, he created languages, thousands of years of history, different cultures and entire mythologies. Every place feels like it existed long before the story began. And the plot is simple enough. Frodo, a hobbit, inherits the One Ring and must travel across Middle-earth to destroy it before the Dark Lord Sauron can reclaim it. But the journey is what makes this book so special. Every location feels unique, every member of the Fellowship brings something different to the story, and there's a real sense that you're traveling alongside the characters. And even after more than 70 years, these books still hold up incredibly well. Nearly every fantasy author has been influenced by Tolkien in one way or another, and after reading Lord of the Rings, it's very easy to understand why. And then we come at my top 3. And third on the list is The Light of Loch Lamora by Scott Lentz. Earlier this year I finally picked up this book after hearing people recommend it for years. And by the time I finished it, I completely understand why it's become such a modern classic. This is probably the best first book in a fantasy series that I've ever read. The story follows Loch Lamora and the Gentlemen Bastards, a gang of thieves trying to rob one of the richest men in the city of Camer. Instead of saving the world, they're simply trying to pull off the perfect crime. And that already makes it feel different from most fantasy novels. What really makes this book stand out is the writing. Scott Lentz writes some of the best dialogue I've ever read. The conversations are funny, clever and completely natural. And the friendships between the characters feel genuine. And because of that, you become invested in everything that happens to them. I also loved the city of Camer. It's one of those settings that feels alive. And by the end of the novel, I felt like I knew the streets almost as well as I did the characters. And this is one of those books that completely lived up to the hype for me, and honestly that's pretty rare. And I think it deserves every bit of praise it gets. And at number 2 I have Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince by J.K. Rowling. Now this is probably the most surprising choice on the list, not because it's a Harry Potter book, but because the Half-Blood Prince is my favorite book in the series. And whenever I see people rank the Harry Potter books, this one often ends up somewhere in the middle, and I've never really understood why. For me, this is where the series reaches its peak. By this point, the books have become much darker and more mature, while still keeping the magic that make the early books so enjoyable. We finally learn about Voldemort's past, which makes him a much more interesting villain than simply being an evil wizard. And I also love the mystery surrounding the Half-Blood Prince. And I think the balance between everyday life at Hogwarts and the growing danger outside the school is handled better in this book than in any other. And then there's the ending. Of course I won't spoil it, but it's one of the most emotional endings I've ever read in fantasy. When I eventually will reread the series, I know this is still the book I look forward to the most. And then my number one is The Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. And if you watched the Game of Thrones TV show and thought season 3 and 4 were the best seasons, there's a very good reason for that, because they were largely based on this book. Now The Storm of Swords is a huge novel, but I honestly never wanted it to end. And every time I thought the story had reached its peak, George Martin somehow found another way to surprise me. And the biggest strength of this book is its characters. Almost everyone is morally grey. People make mistakes, they face the consequences of those mistakes, and nobody feels completely safe. And that unpredictability creates a level of tension that very few fantasy books can match. And I also love the politics. This series is sometimes described as historical fiction with dragons. And that's meant as a compliment. Wars are won through alliances, betrayals and clever strategies just as often as through battles. And decisions matter, and even small choices can have enormous consequences later in the story. And then there are the unforgettable moments. And if you read this book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There were several chapters where I simply had to stop reading for a few minutes because I just couldn't believe what just had happened. And yes, this series still isn't finished, and that's disappointing. But I honestly don't think that should stop anyone from reading these books. What's already been published is some of the greatest fantasy ever written. And for me, A Storm of Swords is the very best fantasy book I've ever read. So, that's my list. And looking at these 10 books, I realized something interesting. I don't actually have one favorite type of fantasy. Some of these books are classic epic fantasy, some are political fantasy, and one is basically a fantasy heist novel. And another one mixes fantasy with horror and westerns. And I think that's one of the reasons I love this genre so much. Fantasy can tell almost any kind of story. And I'm sure this list will change over time. There are still so many series I haven't read yet, like The Wheel of Time, The Realm of the Eldlings, First Law, Malison, and maybe one of those will eventually make this list. And that's one of the best things about being a reader. There's always another amazing book waiting to surprise you. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What is your favorite fantasy book of all time? Do you agree with any of my choices? Or is there one book that should absolutely have been on this list? Let me know in the comments, because I'm always looking for new recommendations. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.